thicker and like tougher. So basically the nerves, they're a whole big clump of axons with lots of connective tissues so they don't get damaged easily. So you can think of them as like a big thick wire carrying information out of the brain. So of course there's lots of nerves that go to the brain because you need input and send output to different places. So they go through those big wires, and then those nerves will split later so those axons can go where they need to go. And we've got 12 different cranial nerves. They all attach to the brain, slightly different places. And they carry different information either to the brain or away from it. So you can see them all up here. You don't have to label where they are or anything. But I do want you to know what they do. And they're actually easier than you might think, because a lot of them, their name tells you what it does. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So how about the olfactory nerve? What do you think it does? Smell. Is it taking signals to the brain or away from the brain? To the brain, right? So you already knew that. You didn't even need me to tell you that, just from its name. Optic nerve, that one's pretty obvious, right? And if you notice up here for all of them, I've either labeled them as sensory nerves or motor, and then we'll also have some that are mixed. So if it's sensory, that means signals going to the brain. If it's motor, it means all the signals are traveling away from the brain to like the muscles or something. So ocular motor, what does that one sound like? It's your eye, because ocular is eye. Motor, it's a motor neuron then. So it moves your eyelid. Maybe you did some pupil. I saw some people do some pupil testing yesterday. So it kind of, and it also moves the lens of your eye too, to help you focus far away and close up. All right, and then we have our trochlear nerve. This is a motor neuron that moves some different eye muscles. Superior oblique. Then the trigeminal nerve is a mixed one. So it takes sensory information from, what's this word anterior mean again? So the front, so like the front of your scalp, your face, oral cavity, kind of this area. So any of those senses that are there, not your vision and smell, but like the skin, like touch and stuff. And then it's a motor neuron. It has motor neurons for your muscles of mastication or chewing. And you have an abducens, which is another motor neuron, and it just controls a few eye muscles. So if you notice, we've got quite a few. It's kind of interesting. You'd think there should just be one, but that's not how we evolved to be for some reason. Facial nerve, this is mixed as well. So it does taste, so that'd be the sensory portion, and then your facial expression muscles controls those. Vestibular cochlear, that's hearing with sensory, so it's a sensory nerve, and it also does your sense of equilibrium, because as you may know, you have special air that help you tell whether you're leaned too far forward or back, which is of course why when you get a really bad sinus infection and pressure builds up there, you start to feel like kind of imbalanced. And you all felt that before? Or vertigo too. So that's the nerve that takes all that information from the inner ear to the brain. All right, so we got our vagus nerve. It's mixed. And if you notice, that's a lot of sort of internal organ stuff. So it's sending information about the heart, the lungs, the abdominal organs. And it's also a motor neuron, so sending signals back out to change the heart rate or increase intestinal secretion, something like that. The vagus nerve, we have accessory nerve, trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscle, hypoglossal, one nerve just for your tongue muscles. Interesting. All right, so just to review those, shouldn't take too long, is the last question on that worksheet, which I'll pull up in case somebody doesn't have it. And that's just going to be describe one symptom a person might have if each of those nerves are damaged. Like, let's say you were some crazy mad doctor and you just went in there and cut that one nerve. What would happen to the person? So you can use the PowerPoint, you can use your group. I'm just going to set the... All right, I don't think we need to go over those. I trust that you came up with something reasonable for all of them. Just supposed to be a slightly more interesting way to go over their functions than just what's the function of each of them. All right. So I didn't make a quiz for today, but is there anything you had questions about? Not all the bold stuff. So if there's anything from the bold you weren't sure on, you should definitely ask about it. Yeah?
For C, to describe the major response of the following organs to the stimulation by the...
Yes.
I didn't know the coronary arteries.
Uh-huh. So the coronary arteries one, it's actually on, I could tell you the answer, but there was a second page to that table, I don't know if you noticed, but it is dilation. Do I? Well, it would have to be one of them. So it'd be either relaxation, because you want more blood to the brain if you're in fight or flight. So you could either say relaxation or dilation. The other one's going to be the opposite, yeah. And then I'll just go through those other ones, just in case, because people have had trouble with them in the past. So remember, this is all, basically today is all sympathetic nervous system, which is mostly fight or flight response. The parasympathetic, that's next time. So we'll see that later. So heart rate, to increase heart rate and force of contraction. It tells the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose into the blood. Tells the pancreas to produce glucagon. And also to secrete less digestive enzymes. And then for the stomach and intestines, less secretions and less smooth muscle contraction. Because if you've got a lion coming to eat you, you don't need to worry about digesting your food and storing energy for weeks from now. You need to worry about not being dead, not being eaten. Smooth muscle contraction, because everything through your GI tract is smooth muscles squeezing the digested food along. So if you slow down the squeezing, then it goes slower. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sympathetic and parasympathetic.
What about the two stimuli that activate?
So for that one, you could have come up with all kinds of stuff.
Okay.
What are two that you found?
I just put physical or emotional. So
Physical or emotional?
Physical or emotional stress.
Okay, yeah.
So
So
you wanted more specific?
I think if it was on an exam or something, maybe like a specific situation, like, loss of blood or being startled by something. Somebody wants to fight you. I don't know. Basically anything that causes you physical or emotional stress would activate it.
Can you do autonomic ganglion?
Yeah, so first, what is a ganglion? Mm-hmm. So it's a collection of neuron cell bodies. So an autonomic ganglion, that's a cluster of neuronal cell bodies that's part of the autonomic nervous system. I have that on the next one too. Right. And then the preganglionic neuron is the one before the ganglion. The post is one after the ganglion. Where did I put that? Oh, it's right here. All right. All right, so let's start with some basics about our autonomic nervous system. So first off, let's kind of orient ourselves a little bit about how this is all connected together functionally. So we just got done doing all the central nervous system stuff, right? Brain and spinal cord. But obviously all those signals, they need to be sent out to the rest of the body. And then the signals need to, get from your fingertips back to the spine or the brain. So we've got the somatic nervous system, which we're not really going to do too much with, but that's like your sensory receptors and then voluntary skeletal muscles you could, voluntarily control. That's the somatic. What we're working on is the autonomic. So if you notice, there's also sensory receptors in this one, but these aren't your conscious sensory receptors. So these are the ones that, tell your brain how much CO2 is in your blood or something. Personally, I don't perceive that. Can anyone tell me what percentage of CO2 is in their blood? Is their body telling them that and they know? It would be really crazy if you somehow knew, like at this moment, the exact percentage. You may know the average, but your brain does know at all times how much oxygen, how much CO2, all these things. It just doesn't tell your cerebrum about it. It just adjusts things to fix any problems. Also, your body temperature, that's monitored by the autonomic nervous system. And then, so that's like, the sensory neurons sending information to the central nervous system. And then the second half of it is the motor neuron part. That's most of what today is. And that's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic halves. So these are mostly involuntary signals coming from the brain and the spinal cord. So could be going to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. It's probably where they mostly go to. All right. So as I mentioned, the autonomic, that's input from sensory receptors that aren't conscious. So they're in your organs, your blood vessels, your muscles in different places. Now, one thing that I think is a little confusing is how all this gets turned on, because it's not conscious. So you're not telling the sympathetic nervous system to be activated. It is your brain, but not the conscious part. So the main part of your brain is the hypothalamus that controls it. So the hypothalamus takes in information from all those sensory receptors out in your body, from your cerebrum, and then from the amygdala. Do you remember what that one did? What it was? So anger, strong emotions. As I'm sure you've noticed, if you get really mad, what happens to your heart rate? Does it go up? Does your skin get red? Because your blood vessels dilate and everything. If you're really excited, that's all coming from the amygdala, telling the hypothalamus, which is activating the sympathetic nervous system. So it's sending that info down the spinal cord and then connecting to all the neurons that went all throughout. So mainly hypothalamus, and then our secondary input is from the cerebral cortex, so your thoughts, the medulla, and the amygdala too. I'm going to put this up here. So you've got and then everything telling hypothalamus. Do you remember what the medulla oblongata did? I'll give you a hint, it's not what was in Waterboy. So if you remember, it helped regulate respiratory rate, heart rate, and for the most part, it does that through the hypothalamus. And I guess we could put this on here too, even though we're not working on it today. All this applies for the parasympathetic too. All these are involved. So the hypothalamus decides, activate this one and this one. Just activate sympathetic. That's basically how they get sympathetic. So we'll keep that up there. All right, so what do you think an example is of the cerebrum, which is, well, you know what that is by now, modifying the autonomic nervous system? All right, so go ahead and chat with your group there. If you do think it's E, which most of you do, be prepared to tell us which ones. Final votes. All right, so a lot of people switched to C, and C is actually the only correct answer up there. And that's because basically all of those up there are the autonomic nervous system, all 4 of those, but only one of them, C, has anything to do with a conscious thought. Right? So you're actually consciously telling yourself to think about something relaxing and changing your heart rate through less sympathetic nervous system activity. And that's actually something we're going to test in lab, see how many of you can actually change your heart rate or blood pressure. We'll decide which one to do consciously. Because you do have some control over it, right? Like, for example, what's another way you could kind of slow down your breathing and heart rate? Anybody held their breath underwater before? Do you feel like you kind of like consciously slowed down everything a little bit? That was you slowing down your heart rate. It's kind of cool. Really? Oh, you're probably not very good about holding your breath and can't stay down there for long. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get into quite a bit of the anatomy of this, how it's all connected. And the first thing to remember is that for the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic, but we're just talking about sympathetic for now, it's 2 neurons in a series, just like one wire connected to another wire going to the final destination. And if you remember sympathetic, this is all motor neurons, so all the signals are going away from the spinal cord towards whatever tissue you're heading to. Let's see. I should pass this out. Let me go ahead and pass this out, and then we'll talk about it. I think it makes more sense. I'm sure you saw this diagram in the book and just flipped past it and didn't want to look at it. I know I didn't want to look at it the first time I saw it. So the first thing, make sure you're on the sympathetic side in blue. And if you look on there, do you see some of the blue lines are solid and some of them are dashed? So the solid lines, do you think those are pre or post ganglionic neurons? They're the pre. So put that up here. That's the pre-ganglionic. And then our dotted one. And the second thing to notice on there is, as you know, neurons, what are the 2 different sides of a neuron, or the 2 ends? Right, it's the dendrite and the axon terminal. So on there, the circle thing represents the dendrite, and this thing represents the axon terminal. And what's it called when an axon terminal meets a dendrite? What's that space? That's like the synapse or synaptic cleft. So on there, anytime you see a dendrite meeting an axon terminal, that's a synapse. And that would be where the pre and the post neuron meet. And for the most part, our preganglionic neuron it connects like the spinal cord to the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron connects the preganglionic neuron to the target tissue. And you can kind of see that on here, how all the solid lines end before they get to the tissues. And they switch over to that next wire, like the next signal. Where are these? Let's see. All right. So for this one, just looking for kind of some simple neurons before we get into the detail. Yeah. So what we're looking for here is kind of like what you did on the lab practical yesterday. Pretty much the same, a little bit simpler. So you're going to draw and label a pre and a post ganglionic neuron, just in series. And then 2 and 3 are just a few more labelings. And you actually don't need that first thing I passed out yet for that. So let me know if you need some markers there. And I'll put this slide back up so it kind of reminds you of where those neurons are going. All right, so nice drawing skills out there. So let's keep going for sympathetic a little bit. So one of the weird things that you notice about this is it looks like there's like 3 spinal cords or something. So this is a little bit strange and confusing, but the sympathetic nervous system has a whole bundle of neuron axons and stuff running next to the spinal cord. Very close to it, but outside of the bony encasing, the actual spinal column. And it does run left and right sides. And one of the important functions it has is obviously, do you remember we said the spinal cord only goes from T1 to L2? And do you see on that diagram there, we want to send some neurons up above T1, like to the heart or to your eyeballs, to your mouth, all that stuff. So that trunk provides a place for those axons to go up. So they can leave the spinal cord and go up and then get close to the eyes before they have to leave. So it kind of provides a protected, somewhat protected place. Same thing for them to go below L2, so down to your bladder and everything else down there. We've got another picture. And if you were to zoom in a little bit, you'd see the vertebrae, and then this would be, the spinal cord itself. So that'd be the dendrite of the preganglionic neuron, and then it comes out, and here's the trunk running right next to the spinal cord. So you could have a synapse there with the next neuron, or you could just come out and go up or go down. Like the axon can just kind of go up or down there. And the only other thing to explain about this one is they're showing you just half of it. Because obviously, do you think maybe on the other side you have a kidney too? So you certainly have everything that they're showing on the right side, on the left side. And the skin that they're showing, that's all throughout on both sides too. Just trying to keep it they wanted to keep it nice and simple for you, right? It's a nice simple diagram. All right. So I think we have talked all about that pretty well. It's a little tiny up here, but I do want to remind you that anywhere where there's a bunch of pre and post neurons meeting, that's a synapse. And when it's a bunch of them together, it's called a ganglion. So these little blue circles, like for example, the renal ganglion, that's where a bunch of the signals coming from the pre-neuron meet a bunch of post-neurons. Because obviously, do you think you just have one neuron telling the kidney what to do? Or do you think it's a whole big network of them? So it's like a big clumpy network. They all meet here, and then the post-ganglionic neurons go from there to here. And then the last one, if there's a bunch of pre and post meeting in the trunk, it's called a sympathetic trunk ganglion. And if it's out here, it's a prevertebral ganglion, something like that. Is that the wrong way? All right. And it should be pretty obvious so far, but when you're looking at that diagram, the cell bodies and the dendrites of all the preganglionic neurons are in the spinal cord. And you can tell that because, remember, our dendrites are the dots, and the preganglionic neurons are the dark or the filled in lines, and they all start in the spinal cord. So the two ganglia. One thing to mention before we keep going, I think this is often a little confusing. Where does the signal actually start for the sympathetic nervous system? Does it start at the spinal cord, or does it start somewhere else? Do you remember what controls the whole system? Yeah, so the hypothalamus in the brain. So all these little neurons down here in the spinal cord, they're getting signals from the hypothalamus down to the spinal cord. It's just that's part of the central nervous system, so they don't draw it on here. But that is what's turning all these different neurons on. All right, so we've got the two different ganglia. I think we mentioned the ones in the trunk are called the trunk ganglia. The ones basically outside of the trunk, so all those little blue circles on there, those are your prevertebral ganglia out there. Again, 3? I think I mean 4. All right. So with your group there, we're going to try to I want to know how signals get from the spinal cord to each of those tissues. So basically just, can you read this diagram? And double check your neighbor. Make sure all of your neighbors are looking at the sympathetic nervous system with the blue lines. If you see anyone looking at red lines, they're probably going to have a hard time. They'll be very confused. And one other thing, there may be more than one answer to some of these, which is okay.